Hi everyone, welcome to Crushing Doubt. I'm Dr. Dan Ratner. On this episode, Julie Conrad and I talk about how doubt can affect all of our decisions. Our guest today is mind-body medicine doctor John Strax. Like me, he is always working on ways to get more specific in his methods of helping pain and symptom sufferers. Julie and I close with some of the how-to when it comes to getting better. This time looking at some of the very specific action steps you can utilize in response to your emotions. All right, so what I want to start off talking about, as we usually start with our broad topic of doubt and how it has all of these applications, one of the main applications that I can see in it is when we're making decisions and the kind of doubt it brings up. Different things come to mind, like when I was applying to college, there was all this doubt, but I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to deal with that.
My daughter's going through that right now.
What? How old is your daughter?
She's 16.
Oh, they start that at 16?
Yeah.
Oh,
but
God.
talk about doubt. That's, I said, let's talk about that.
Yeah. So she's a sophomore?
Yeah. She's a junior, actually.
I was going to say, I didn't start that.
She's a young junior.
Yeah, but still, once you're a junior, you do start to think about,
hey, what do you want to do for the rest of your life? You're 16.
I know. A lot of people don't know what they want to do for the rest of their lives when they're like 75, and they didn't know what they wanted to do in the first place. But one of the things that I wanted to focus on is that when you have doubt, it is much more likely that you will make a decision that isn't a great fit for you. Now, listen, when you're 16, 17, 18, that is bound to happen. Everybody is going to make a choice that maybe wasn't the best for them in a certain way. So when I was applying to college, of course, I was an 18-year-old like anybody else, but it's like I didn't want to let in the fact that there was doubt. And I just decided on something. I decided, okay, my friend went to Brown. I visited her. There was this great discussion there. And I just kind of let my imagination take me to a place where I was like, yeah, that's good. So I didn't actually have doubt. But then when I showed up, I was like, I don't really like Rhode Island. I should have chosen a place where I was like more in the countryside. I should have gone to a smaller school. I should have investigated the kind of departments here that were good. There were plenty of things I got out of it, but I didn't make the best decision. And I don't fault myself for that, especially because of how old I was at the time. But as my life has gone further, one thing that I found is that we really want to think about doubt and whether it's affecting our decisions. So,
right, or our ability to make a decision at all.
At all, yeah. I don't tend to have that problem, but a lot of people do. And I completely get that. It's some people can be very decisive as a way of resolving that.
I mean, I think it's a lot of times. Don't you think it's also the fear of making the wrong choice or missing out? I know my daughter talks a lot about that. Of just, she's always had a difficult time making decisions. And I asked her, why do you think it's so hard for you to make a decision? And she said, well, because I'm so afraid that I'm going to miss something. Like if I choose A over B, then I'm going to miss out on B if I choose A, so that makes it, there's so many different ways you can look at that.
That was a very decisive answer, her, by the way. Amazing.
I'll tell her that. She'll feel great.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to talk about, though, is the idea of groupthink and kind of societal views. There's all kinds of views that society brings to us. And I'm not even saying they're wrong about everything. They could have some great ideas, but this is from Say Anything, one of my favorite movies.
Oh my gosh.
Remember
that's also my favorite movie. So now we have two movies that are like our absolute favorites. So
wow. Wait, what was the other? Was it
Harry Met Sally?
Shawshank? Oh, When Harry Met Sally.
Well, I
like Shawshank?
I like Shawshank too, but we could go on.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. We have very similar movies.
Sorry about that.
We digress, but we'd have no doubt.
I know exactly what you're gonna quote too.
Okay, so the guidance counselor comes to Lloyd Dobler and says, you're the one person who didn't put down what you wanted to do. And he says, yeah, but how many of these people actually know what they want to do? I mean, isn't it better to just say like, I don't know right now? And he's completely right, but he's not the typical person, certainly of that age, but even of any age. There's so many of us. There are people who have definitely had kids because they just thought they should.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that that's even necessarily a bad thing. Kids are a wonderful thing, but the decision of who to marry, what career path to choose, where to live. I mean, it can be uh it can be an exercise in fighting with yourself. And that's if you're aware of the doubt. If you're not aware of the doubt, you're in a much worse spot.
Right.
Just kind of at the whim of things.
Yeah, I remember I had a friend in college, and she used to say to me, she at one point she got upset with me because she's like, basically I was doing everything that you do at that age, right? Go to school, and then you get your degree, and then you get your job, and then you get married, then you have kids. And that wasn't necessarily her journey, which was totally fine. But there was some resentment that, like, you do everything by the book. And I remember her saying that, by the book. And I wasn't going by any kind of book. I just kind of knew what I wanted to do. But because her perspective was a little bit different on that, I think she was stuck in that. Like, well, maybe I'm supposed to be doing that, maybe I'm not supposed to be, and she's doing all these things, and it was tough.
What's interesting about that story is she sounds like she doesn't have that much doubt, but really, I think that was coming from a place of doubt. It was coming from a wish to do things a certain way and not feeling totally okay inside the self that I can do that. I don't need to go the same path as you.
Right.
And
that's eventually what we figured out in talking that out. But it's so interesting. And I think back to what you said about, choosing a partner and getting married and all these things. I also look at that too. Sometimes there's like a codependency, and I'm sure you could go on and on about the definition of that, but that, it's kind of like, well, okay, mom and dad used to do all this stuff for me and tell me what to do and this and that. And this is just kind of the next thing. And if I, maybe if I get in this relationship and just solidify it, get married, then, that codependency just kind of continues on.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it's one that really fits with a lot of what we talk about in this podcast, particularly the power column, because the power column really is about emerging as your own individual. And let's also call it what it is. You don't just like emerge as your own individual and then you're there for the rest of your life. This is actually, it's more like an accordion. You expand and then you come back in. There are times where you are independent and there's times where you feel dependent. It really comes and goes.
I like that. I like that because I think too that sometimes that even just saying, oh, so-and-so, they're so codependent, or no, because I feel like you're exactly right. There are times where we really need that. And then there are times where we need to be able to break apart. And I think that when we're not able to, distance ourselves in a way that we can learn about who we are, then is that kind of what you're saying? Then that becomes the problem.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wasn't thinking about it in this way when we started this discussion, but as we, have got to this point, I started to realize, a lot of this is about separation. We're little kids. We look up to our parents, and we in the very early years, we feel almost merged with them. I mean, as babies, that is actually what happens in emotional development, is this sense of merger, and then we get a sense of them being different, and that can be very upsetting, and we then have to figure out what to do. Even with walking, you're realizing you've distanced yourself from the person that you thought you were totally connected to and totally dependent on. And really, I think that's a lot of what life is all about, is expanding beyond those times and then being able to check back in. And with significant others, and this, I think, is if things go well, you have that ability to check back in, but to grow also. And ideally, you're really able to do both. I think there are some people who try to deal with the doubt of those moments by just saying, I'm going to be independent for the rest of my life, and that's it. Yep. Then they're denying the side of them that wants the connectedness or needs that connectedness. Whereas then there are people who are like, I'm going to keep living the exact life that I always did, and I'm going to stay in those, boxes. Not to say that that's what you were doing with your friend, but it's really good to develop both sides of the equation. So I'm really excited about this idea, and it's even true from a professional standpoint. The discovered Sarno, and for a while, I guess you would say I was like, I wouldn't say codependent on him, but I was kind of like, this is my model. And then I had to develop
learning that.
past
you were
that.
absorbing that.
So, you know, I'm going to sit down now with Dr. John Strax. He's a guy who, like me, had to find his way towards that independence. And now we're going to compare notes about where we stand in this field. I want to welcome to the show Dr. John Strax. He is a mind-body medicine physician in Chicago. Many of you watching this will already know him. And in fact, John, I think people are kind of almost familiar with us together. They're certainly in terms of watching me, they're most familiar watching me with you. So this is incredibly comfortable for me, and I will do my best to make it comfortable for you. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. It's nice to see you.
You too. So, you know, you and I have been doing a lot of talking lately about how we are providing things for people, how we want to provide things for people. But I find a big part of the power of the change that people get from these podcasts and shows and interviews is to hear about the specific mind-body story that you experienced. So I just want to touch on it briefly. We were saying before this interview, I want to bring you back on to just do the whole thing, you know, because the stories can be long. But give us the gist of how you discovered mind-body medicine.
So I like to say that I was living in Chicago in my late 20s and kind of going through an early life crisis, and managed to fall down a flight of stairs on the Riverwalk in front of the river in Chicago. And I popped up, dusted myself off, and sort of walked along and thought I was fine. And then I started having these strange symptoms about 3 months later. Started like dragging my foot behind me when I was at work, and started getting numbness and tingling and shooting sensations in my hand. And I couldn't type really well, and wasn't quite sure what it was, but I had remembered this fall. And so I just associated it with that. And I started, saw my physician. He's like, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's carpal tunnel. Sent me to a hand surgeon. Surgeon looked at it. He's like, it's not carpal tunnel. I had this early days of the internet. I printed out some information on thoracic outlet syndrome. And I was like, I think it's that. And the surgeon's like, no, I don't think it's that. And so I just kept getting tossed around from practitioner to practitioner. No one was sure what it was, but it kept getting worse. I really was having trouble typing. I was having trouble walking, and it started taking over my mind. And I couldn't think about anything else. Why are these symptoms here, and what is it? And like I said, it's kind of early days of the internet, 1998 maybe. And so searching, what is this? What's the symptom about? And I started going to acupuncturists and chiropractors and napropaths, and every alternative practitioner I saw said, oh yeah, I see this all the time. I know what it is. I'll make it better. And sometimes it would get a little bit better, sometimes not. But within a couple of days, it was as bad as it could be, and kept getting worse. And I stopped doing my normal activities. I'm an athlete. I've always been an athlete. I wasn't exercising. I have this distinct memory of essentially being in a yoga class for invalids and having 3 of the teachers help me with a back bend that I do for 10 minutes at a time now by myself. And
that's impressive, by the way.
Yeah. It's not really 10 minutes, but so I had this, I remember having this thought, I was a varsity college athlete, what the heck am I doing here? But there was no clue as to what it was. And so finally, after maybe 9 months of this, of getting worse, of suffering, talking to people, I was at a cocktail party, and I was standing with one of my friends who had thrown out his back. And if he's listening, Danny, thank you for doing that. And so he was standing here like this, and a third friend came over and said, Danny, what'd you do? And he's like, oh, I was playing basketball, I threw out my back. And our third friend says, yeah, I remember when I used to throw out my back, but then I went and I saw this physician in New York City who explained to me what it was, and now my back is fine. In fact, he said he remembers like when he used to hang upside down from his anti-gravity boots and would have this thought like, this can't be the way to treat it. But he had, he had gotten in to see, he'd snuck in to see our colleague, Dr. John Strax in New York, who had explained that back pain was much more psychological than physical, and our friend had gotten better. And so I was kind of on the outside of this conversation, but I was thinking like, I know who Dr. Sarno is. I've read those books, but I hadn't connected it because it wasn't in my back. And so I went home from the yeah.
You had read them, but you hadn't connected it yet.
I had not connected it. I knew who he was. I was in the process of applying to medical school. That was one of the three main stressors that was going on. And I had been always quite interested in alternative healing practices. And so I had done a fair amount of reading, including those books, and I'd liked them, but I hadn't connected it. And so I went home, I had his books. I went home at the end of the cocktail party and I got his book off my bookshelf and I read it that night before I went to bed. I was like, oh, too much going on in my life all at once. And so the next day I came home from work and I dusted off my bicycle, which was in the basement of the house, and I put air in the tires and I got on it. And I rode out to the lakefront bike path in Chicago. I was living in the South Side by the University of Chicago. And I started writing, and it was excruciating. Like every pedal is like shooting pains would shoot from my foot into my hip. And I kept repeating to myself, like, this is not a physical issue. This is not a physical issue. This is not a physical issue. And after like 4 miles, which would have been, 25 minutes, it just started to calm down. Like the pain and the symptoms started to get better. And I rode all the way downtown and I turned around and I rode back. For years, I told that story. I was like, yeah, I got home and I was better. And then I was giving a talk one time and I unearthed the journal that I kept in the aftermath of that. And for weeks after that, I was like, I don't know, am I better? Am I not better? I don't know. Like maybe I should go see a mind-body medicine physician. But I kept sort of getting better. So I was probably like 70% better by the time I got home. Like it was significant improvement. And then over a couple of months' time, I did some internal work and I had already been in psychotherapy, and the symptoms just calmed down. And then in this journal, there's like a 6-week break in the journal writing and one last journal entry where I was like, I think I'm better. Like it hasn't been there. And then that was that. And it was over 20 years ago. And, I've done 100-mile bike rides. I do an hour of yoga every morning. I play golf with my kids. I play basketball when I get a chance. Like it's just it's nothing like what it was in those 9 months before I found Dr. Sarno's book and reread it and understood what was going on.
It's incredibly powerful to hear you talk about it. And I find this with everybody that I talk to, or most people that I talk to about it. A couple of things. One, we all have these memories of these breakthroughs, but I love that you looked back and said, oh, wait, it wasn't quite like that. It actually, and I'm getting a lot of questions about this on this podcast about the process of things. A lot of people get panicked if they're like, well, I didn't have that happen and I didn't get better right away. It really is a process with the mind. I think I know you and I are in agreement about this because we've had some extensive discussions about this, but it's a process of your interaction with your own mind. And that's what we're hearing in your mind-body trajectory. But it also brought to mind that this is just my interpretation of it. I'm curious to know what you think about it. But obviously we talk about doubt a lot on this show. It seemed like you had to push through certain levels of doubt. I know there's many ways of thinking about it, but that was one of the things that seems like it's happened for you. And now, where you stand now, or where I stand now, we've done so much work to understand it and to metabolize it for ourselves that I don't have a lot of doubt for myself about this. And I want to help other people have that too. But does that sound kind of accurate to your journey?
I think so. My journey is a little bit different, at least in that story. I had these 9 months of just assuming I had some sort of physical disorder that nobody could diagnose, which I think I was talking to a patient earlier today. And my initial appointments are an hour long, which is a lot of time, especially for a physician. But sometimes people's stories are several hours long. But anyway, she and I talked for about 55 minutes. And at the end, she said, thank you so much for listening. Most physicians just roll their eyes and walk out of the room, which is, that's heartbreaking just on its own. But I think one of the reasons I can do that is because I've had this experience. I know what it's like to search and not know the answer and feel like there's no hope. And then because I had some of this experience ahead of time, right? I had read Dr. Sarna's book. I knew I am pretty psychological to begin with. And so when I reread it, I knew what it was. And so then I could get on my bicycle and I could ride and I can push through it. A lot of my patients, they still, even after we talk through it, even after they learn about it or read about it, there's still doubt there. And so it's harder to get on and do that kind of flooding activity. I didn't know it by that name at the time, but that's what I did. I just kept pushing through the physical pain until it got tired essentially and left. But I think for a lot of people, there's still that doubt. I was lucky in that moment that I knew 100% in my mind that I knew what it was, and that let me go out and just push through until it got better.
I think a lot about this because it is such a big part of how I think about things. But I'm curious, maybe we can think together a little bit about what makes one person have more doubt versus another. And this is a very broad question, so I don't expect us to answer it. But I'm curious, in your experience seeing people, and you do the Hope for Healing podcast with Curable, and which is one I was fortunate enough to be on with you. But sometimes you will actually interview patients you've worked with. And so you get to hear all these different stories. I think the stories are incredibly powerful, and they tell us a lot about the differences between people. So what have you seen in those stories?
So the stories on the Hope for Healing podcast are, patients who have done really well over time. And so we're trying to give people who are listening an example of what the possibilities are. One of the things that people tell me is oftentimes they hear stories of people who are successful, and a lot of those people are successful really quickly. That's the story that I just told. And so Wednesday night, we're doing the next episode. I'm doing a patient of mine who had debilitating foot pain, really couldn't walk more than a few steps. And she got better, 0.5% a month for 4 years. And that ultimately was how she got better. And so some people really can move quickly, but a lot of people move forward in fits and starts and get better over time and have to keep coming back to you or to me and say are you sure? Are you sure there's no physical damage? And you and I can say yeah, we've looked at the research. We've seen, hundreds or thousands of patients and clients on this. And yes, we can tell you that you are not in danger and you're not going to damage your body if you get on your bike or go out for a run or go back to yoga class or whatever it is. I think that my patients who move through this more quickly are the ones who are a little bit more psychologically minded, have had some experience maybe with psychotherapy previously, or just have a more psychological understanding of the world around them. The patient I was talking to this morning had been suffering for a decade or more with migraines and all kinds of other inexplicable symptoms, and had been very much in the conventional medical system. So mostly about medications and procedures and imbalances in her body that her body workers were trying to work out. And so for her, it's a big switch from thinking about it this way to thinking about it this way. And so I think oftentimes people need to hear this 10 and 20 and 50 and 100 times before it really starts to sink in. Yes, the symptoms are in our body, but the cause of the symptoms isn't coming from our body. And that's just, it's not really talked about very much in the conventional medical system. And so I think for some people, it's just a big shift in thinking that takes a while to wrap our head around.
It's a really great way of putting it. And it's making me think there are these big shifts. And one of those shifts is from a medical or physical or purely physical standpoint to the mind-body standpoint. But I think there's lots of shifts that can happen, and they all relate to doubt. So if you come from a family that thinks very strongly about something one way, but you've got to get to a different point to be able to believe in this or even just entertain the idea, you might have more doubt on top of it. Or if you're a person who isn't used to being powerful, this is another thing I talk about a lot is the power aspect. People who are kind of more used to taking on power in their own lives and taking control of things, they tend to have an easier time having less doubt, and then they get better a bit faster. And I think it's important that people don't blame themselves for the pace that it happens, because the way, I mean, I'm sure you'll agree with this, but your mind works how it works. All of our minds work how we work. We come from the backgrounds we come from. So I always encourage people, let's work with you and don't be so worried. Some of those people who move fast through it, they did a lot of work on certain aspects. Or maybe they had certain benefits. I mean, I grew up in a very psychologically minded family, so I had that advantage. There were other disadvantages to growing up in my family, but I'm not going to say them here because they'll be mad at me. Well, we'll talk about that later, family. But another thing you and I have been talking about recently, I think this is a big focal point for certainly for me and you, and hopefully for some other mind-body practitioners, is getting more specific and detailed. Because this is the question we hear over and over. How do we do this? You know, they're so hungry for it. I love working with this population because they really want to get better. They really want to know things. They're curious. They're open. But they want to know how. And you and I have talked about this. You know, we're wondering about the action steps we can take. I'm just wondering how you're thinking about it so far. I mean, I happen to know, but I want you to share it with other people, or at least I know some of it, how you're thinking about the action steps we can take. And maybe you can talk a little bit about the dialogue we've had and what it's made you think of.
So I think that historically, people, you come into this, like, you know, they'll read one of Dr. Sarno's books and they'll say, okay, I can see myself in what he describes. I'm perfectionistic, I'm hard driving, I like to please other people, I keep my emotions in check. And those are the types of personality characteristics that I think contribute to us expressing what's going on in our lives in our bodies so that it feels like a physical symptom, like, say, back pain. And then, you know, read those books, or now there's, you know, a lot of information online on the Curable app. And so people will read that. Maybe they should journal write or meditate or try some sort of healing imagery. And I think those are great. And I think historically, those are the kinds of tools that are helpful in calming down what's going on internally so that the physical symptoms can calm down. I think some of the things that you and I have been working on lately are, well, really, what is going on underneath the surface that's causing us to express the pain in this way? And in addition to those personality traits, which are important, I and you have found some others that are important too. Self-criticism, for instance, like people who are really hard on themselves, which goes along with perfectionism. That, I think, is a very common reason that pain will develop. I think keeping our emotions inside and not knowing what to do with them, or not even recognizing that they're there, that will come out in our bodies as pain. Stressful situations, either in the present or in the past, will cause us to express in our bodies what hasn't gotten expressed any other way. Traumatic experiences will get expressed in our bodies. One of my heroes in this field is Bessel van der Kolk, who's one of the world's experts in trauma treatment and research. And the name of his book is The Body Keeps the Score, because we know that those types of experiences will show up in people's bodies. And if, as a clinician, I know what I'm looking for, if I know that traumatic experiences look this way in people, somebody can come into my office and I can say, like, wow, tell me about what's gone on in your life, because I can tell that it's been significant. Whereas if you don't know about it, then you can walk into another clinician's office who's not aware of that, and it just looks like, I don't know what this is. It looks like fibromyalgia. I don't, try some Lyrica. I don't know what to do. And so what you and I have been thinking about is, how can we help people identify the specific reasons that they're expressing the pain? And then how can we help them with very specific and targeted treatments in those areas so that they can get better more quickly and more fully?
So one of the things that I know we've shared is I have this action steps PDF, which is by no means comprehensive, and it's huge anyway. There's like 140 suggested either actions and this is something that I've come to realize, I actually need to pose it as, it's potentially helpful ways of thinking. But it does get very specific, and I'm not saying I have the answers or anybody has the answers, but these are ways to start building the answers, and I just think people need more. And when you and I talked about it, and I obviously welcome any commentary you have on those things that I mentioned, because they do get pretty specific, and maybe some jumped out at you. But I know one of them we talked about that I think is really important is the idea that things actually can change rapidly. And this is a tricky spot to talk about, because I also do want to send the message, hey, if it's not changing rapidly, that doesn't mean there's something wrong or wrong with you. Plenty of people take a long time. In fact, my recovery story was both rapid and slow at the same time. Some of it I got over very quickly, and some of it I can alter in the moment very quickly. And other parts go they spread out and take some time. And you had talked about some of your thinking on this. I call it moment-to-moment thinking, where you challenge the notion that you're stuck in one place, and you challenge the notion that you're going to be there for a long time. That doesn't mean it's going to work necessarily right then, but it is an important part to fold in. And I know you've experienced some similar things. You talked about David Burns. Can you talk a little bit about your viewpoint on that?
Yeah, I think, there are people who will hear about this subject, right? You can say to them, you should consider the possibility that the pain is not stemming from a physical injury or a physical cause, and it will click. And, somewhat similar to the story that I just told, and people can get better within minutes sometimes, or days. And those are a lot of the stories that people hear, and those are really inspiring and powerful. And then I have patients who have been very, very diligently working on this for years, and just slowly and somewhat unsteadily get better, but are so much better now than they were at the beginning. And you and I have talked a little bit about, like, is this mind body medicine is an acute issue where, like, you can treat it and then it's gone? Or is it a chronic issue where, like, you need to treat it and keep working on it over time? And talked a little bit about, maybe it's some of both, or sort of it feels chronic, but really if you think of it moment to moment, like you're talking about, then it's more acute. But either way, we're trying to get the targeted treatment to the right people, especially people for whom, like, reading a book, doing some journal writing, watching our podcasts isn't enough. They need somebody with a lot of experience working very specifically. And so one of the things that I've been doing with my found COVID time, because I'm not going out anymore and doing things, and there's no commute time in Chicago. And so I've got this extra time. So I've been studying cognitive therapy with David Burns this year. And I really, full discussion is beyond the scope of what we can talk about here, But his model is that thoughts cause suffering in terms of our feelings, or in this case, in terms of our symptoms. And if we can change our thoughts, we can change the way we feel. And so he would argue that we should get very, very specific about what kinds of things we're saying in our minds, both in general and when the symptoms are present, and then use all the wonderful tools that have been developed over, half a century at this point to change the way we're thinking about this. Very quick story about this. One of my patients saw me just once, and I never saw her again. But she had been dealing with this for 3 or 4 years. And one of the things she told me was that she had a lot of guilt over her father's death. And I was like, oh, what happened? Tell me more. And she said that she woke up in the middle of the night in California and just knew that she had to call her parents in India. So she got on the phone and she called them. Must have been like 3, 4 in the morning over there. And her mother answered the phone, put her father on, and then her father died while she was talking to him. And she said, like, I killed him. Like, it was too much for him. I killed him. I was like, what? No. That's an amazing story that you told. Like, you knew in California that you had to be on the phone with your father within moments to comfort him as he was dying. Like, that's incredible. And she's like, no. And so we did a few various techniques and we kind of talked through it. And we did a little role play. And I became the part of her brain that said, you killed your father. And she's like, I don't know. And then we switched it around and I was like, no, I didn't kill him. Like, playing her, I didn't kill him. Like, I comforted him. I was there. It was an amazing spiritual opportunity for both of us. And then we switched it back. And I said, okay, I'm going to play the part of your brain. You killed your father. And she's like, what? That makes no sense at all. Like, we had unlocked it and we had changed that thought so that it was no longer valid in her mind. And that was real lasting change.
So this reminds me, you're an MD and I'm a psychologist. And with my background, I think about the therapy process. This mind-body medicine or thinking has changed my way of even practicing psychology. And one of the reasons is it's along the lines of what you said. One thing I've thought about is people have these aha moments and they're like, oh, that session really unlocked something for me. But sometimes you can go for 2 or 3 or even 4 years without that. And then suddenly it happens. But the thing that's so interesting is when the change happens, it can be very rapid. And that got me thinking. And I originally started thinking about it because I found it to be true in the body, but I have found it to be true in the mind too. Just because you're not changing fast doesn't mean that fast change can't happen. And a lot of times and I want to say this very clearly, it's not, I don't think of it as anybody's fault if that doesn't happen. I do think, though, as clinicians, we can help those moments happen faster if we understand what's happening. And to me, that's where doubt and power and these other concepts that are different than just emotions lead to a need for distraction, which I'm not saying is not the case. That what Sarno talks about, I do think can be the case, but it's not always what's happening. And it isn't always the thing that will lead to the aha moment because it's not always what's happening. So if we can understand how is your mind actually working, I'll give you an example, you being the viewer, but John, you as well. If somebody's saying, well, I just have doubts as to whether I get better, what I like to do is get very specific and explore. Now, what is your actual doubt about? And we might drill down until we get to a point where maybe it gets down to, oh, wait, I don't just doubt that I'm going to get better. I very specifically doubt that I myself can trust my own mind, for example. That's just one out of thousands of possible doubts. So that's what I like to do, is to try to articulate those. And that sounds very similar to what you're saying about what you did with that woman. She had a very, very specific thought. And that doesn't mean that everybody needs very specific attention from us necessarily, especially if we can generalize this model and help people understand. It's funny, we're trying to generalize a model about being specific, but it really is true. The more specific we can get, the more we can unlock what is going on in that particular mind. And that's what I found with myself. I would read the books, but I had to read lots of books, and I had to ask lots of questions. And I met with Eric Sherman and asked him all my questions. And you know what's really interesting? You were talking about, you were going through your experience in the early days of the internet. I was going through it at a time where the internet would have provided more, and it's baffling to me, but I really didn't look. It's so strange to me that I didn't, but I guess I just was so set on these ideas, and no one helped me unlock this. And I think as we start to talk about this and shift the way we're thinking about it, it can shift things very quickly. And included in that is, can we get more specific? Because I think a lot of people are feeling that they are being treated generally, even within our specific field. And so, you know, John and I have plans to make some of this work, and I think we all need to be talking not only as clinicians, but also as patients or sufferers. We need to be speaking up about what we need. But John, I wanted to thank you for joining me. Every time we talk, I feel like I get something new out of it, and I hope you will come back on. And maybe I'll come back on yours at some point. We just have a great time talking. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I agree. It is delightful to talk with you about this subject. It's one of my favorite subjects to talk about, and you're one of my favorite people to talk to about it. So it's a really good match. Thanks for having me today.
All right. More coming soon from both of us.
I love that he talks about collaboration. I mean, that's how you and I found each other. I mean, this is what we need. This is, I think, what you're talking about in changing the discussion out in the world, out in your field, in our fields. It's great.
It's totally true. And I think the collaboration can happen on many different levels. I mean, look at you and I, we're mind-body practitioners of a totally different type. But here we are having these discussions. And, you know, I'm going to learn from you. You're going to learn from me, I hope. John and I have...
But I'll tell you, it definitely helps when you have a doctor in front of your name. Because it just gives this validity that for some reason people have a tough time in the alternative medicine world to, you know...
I think that's absolutely true. But, you know, it's interesting because John Strax has the doctor kind that's an MD. That helps even more. It's just, it carries more clout. And I've said this many times, but even I, reading Dr. Sarno, I was like, thank goodness a medical doctor is saying this. I wouldn't want it first to come from a psychologist, and this is coming from a psychologist. You know, I know what I'm talking about, but I wouldn't feel comfortable if the medical field hadn't, and science hadn't, you know, shown that this really was the case entirely. So now I feel much more comfortable about that. And the people I see have been cleared by medical doctors. So that allows me to say, okay, now I can get in there and do my thing as a psychologist.
And that's exactly what I do as well in working with people, you know, Ayurvedically, that we really make sure, just same way that they've been cleared, that these issues are not life-threatening. And then we feel much, you know, as a health counselor, to understand that that this is something, that this digestive issue has been going on forever, but everything's been cleared, and now we can move forward.
Yeah. So the collaboration's huge, but it is really interesting because looking back on it, and speaking of doubt, it's really interesting sometimes how we think we couldn't have had good input before. So I'm going to give an example. We're going to get into some very specific action steps. And I wanted to remind everyone, action steps are often ways of thinking. Sometimes it's going to be about something you do, but sometimes it's a new way of thinking, which is enacting something and then changes the physiology. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is random theories. When people have symptoms, they often are trying to come up with an explanation, and they do their best. And they say, I woke up with shoulder pain. I must have just slept on it wrong. I now hear that in a different way than I used to. I used to be like, well, yeah, I guess that's possible because we just don't know. Now I hear that kind of statement, and I think that's a random theory. It's just saying this is the best explanation I can come up with. And we get things like that all the time. But one thing that I've come to see, especially when you're relying on science and logic, and you see that they really do add up, you don't have to rely on random theories. If your theory doesn't make sense, what it usually means is there is a theory out there that does make sense. So I'm going to give the example that I often give to people. This is, I don't know why I zeroed in on this, but it just makes sense to me. So when they were studying the orbits of the planets, once they had figured out that the sun wasn't rotating around the Earth, they made the assumption that it was circular orbits, because it behaved mostly like circular orbits. But when they looked at the stars, they said, well, how come these only align about 80% of the time? So it was an astronomer named Kepler who came along, and he said, no, they're not behaving like circular orbits. They're behaving like elliptical orbits. And when he put that theory into practice, guess how many times the stars aligned correctly? 100% of the time. A good theory gets it right 100% of the time. If you sleep on your shoulder and you wake up fine every night for 39 years, and then suddenly you wake up and you slept on your shoulder wrong, I understand the potential logic behind it, but you've got to see how random that is. Why on earth would that be? But when you start applying emotional logic to it, then something like that could happen. Because for 39 years, you were fine, you were expressing the issues in a different way, or maybe a different mind-body symptom was coming up. The thing I like about the theory that I have, and that Sarno has, and so many other mind-body practitioners do, is that they don't rely on randomness. They rely on the overarching theory that the mind alters physiology. So here's how you use that as an action step. You use that to disarm and disable faulty theories that you're left grappling with. This works for doubt too, by the way, of course. And it's especially good with doubt. But when it comes to an emotion, if you're having a symptom, let's say the middle of the day, and you think, oh, I just bent my arm wrong. Well, you can apply the idea of random theories here to redirect yourself and say, no, that was not random. There was a reason that I had a physical response there. And barring it being some clear collision or some very physical event, you can assume there's an emotion there and you can start to look there. So that is an action step right there. You're disabling the random theory and you're looking beneath at how to understand this from an emotional standpoint. Go ahead.
So does that mean, to disable it, you are saying to yourself, okay, pause, take a moment, what's happening? It could be this emotional response.
Yeah.
That's the disarmament.
Well, okay. So, I like the way you asked that question. I learned so much from the different questions I get. So maybe we would say at first you're not disabling it. You're calling it into question. That's the action step. Call it into question if it seems random in any way.
First, you're aware of it.
First, you're aware. Yes.
First, you have to become aware, and then
you become aware of it. You call it into question. You run it through logic and science. You consider whether it's emotional, and once you get to the end of that, then you can decide: is this a theory worth keeping? Did I just randomly snap my elbow and it really hurt? Or was there something emotional going on? It just gives you a chance to pause and think about those things. So that's one very specific action step you can use. Another one that's very similar to that, because it's about how we stop ourselves from going down the wrong path, is what I call moment-to-moment thinking. We've talked about this before. This is one of the most important of my action steps. Basically, a lot of the times when we think about what's happening with ourselves physically, we are thinking that our bodies are these monolithic beings that just go through life and are fine, and suddenly not.
Right.
That seems like a random theory, by the way. Why is that? Even if you say that the body starts to degenerate, well, why does it fall apart when it does? And a lot of people will say, I don't know, you hit a wall at a certain age. If that were true, it would just get worse and worse.
That you hear all the time.
Yeah.
That's where the, aging sucks. It doesn't have to.
Definitely not.
It really, really doesn't.
I feel much better in my body than I did certainly in my late 20s and 30s when I was having crippling back pain, but even earlier than that.
And I think you have to understand. You have to understand and accept your body wherever it is, whatever, if you're healing or if you're noticing, I played basketball hard for recreationally for years, but maybe playing 3 nights a week now is not so good for me. Maybe, and I think this is where you're talking about logic, and I call it natural intelligence, but I think we're kind of saying the same thing. That there's just this innate intelligence that's telling us like, maybe I should lay off 3 days a week. But if we're not listening to that,
okay,
then,
but let me challenge you on something, and not you specifically necessarily, but that idea. What you're saying is true, but also that kind of innate intelligence can easily get used against you in ways that don't actually work. Where, I play full court basketball. I was playing once a week before the pandemic hit, and I will get back to it then. And I'm telling you, I was less sore after those games than I used to be because I challenged the idea that soreness was inevitable. Moment-to-moment thinking challenges the idea that whatever's going to happen is inevitable. What it basically says is you are a being moment to moment. You've got a mindset at a given moment. The body will follow. I'm not saying there is no physical world, but your mindset will change whether you have certain responses. So I used to think I would be sore after playing basketball the next day. Once I started moment-to-moment thinking, I started thinking, no, that's what I'm thinking in this moment. What am I thinking in the next moment? What am I thinking in the moment I wake up? And you know what I found? I'm never sore the next day. I mean, I would be
that's interesting.
If I bumped something, but otherwise, no.
That's interesting because, what I find is that the more we become attuned to the messages, like you're saying, just the mind-body awareness. So I've been working for, over a decade with people, especially into their 50s and 60s, where they start to, it is so clear the boundary of the mind and the body. The guy that's going to hit the elliptical 5 days a week and keep coming to me because he's in pain.
Yep.
And, not having the awareness that his body's screaming at him not to. And then the other person that's saying like, you know what? I think, what my body is telling me is that playing tennis, 4 or 5 days a week is my shoulders are just doesn't make me feel good. Whereas you can say you do feel good. So it is an individual listening process.
It is. And there are times where you're going to want to challenge it in the way that I did. And then there's times you're going to want to listen the way that you did. I think, though, that there's really 2 types of listening. There's listening to the physicality of things, which people actually do pretty well. They sometimes over-listen to that. But they don't tend to listen as much to what is the body saying about me emotionally. And that's where moment-to-moment thinking is so important, because in a given moment, when you're having a symptom, most people don't think, what is happening for me emotionally right now? They're thinking, what is happening for me physically? So you want to pause and you want to give yourself a chance to think, what's happening emotionally? Now, I want to transition to some questions that I've either received in the past or just recently. So one of the first is, when does it stop being an emotional issue and become a doubt issue? I love this question because a lot of times people come to me and they're saying, I've been looking at the emotional issues all the time and I can't figure out what's going on. And then I have to introduce the idea of a doubt issue. Other times people come to me and they say, I've been looking at doubt, the whole time. And I say, well, wait, hold on. Did you check in about emotions? And I understand that can get very confusing, but here's my kind of blanket answer about this, and it's going to sound unsatisfying at first, but ultimately I think is very useful. The real thing is, it all depends on what you are thinking. So you could have an emotional issue that persists for weeks and it continues to drive the symptom. You also could have an emotional issue that lasts for 15 minutes or 10 minutes, but then gets you worried. There's something wrong with me. And then it becomes a doubt issue. So it's not really about there being a time period where it shifts from one to the other. It's about a belief system. In fact, you can shift back and forth between these two problems, all depending on your belief system. Go ahead, Julie. What were we going to ask?
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense, because I think of how many times where, it doesn't even matter what it is. It could be you have a stomach ache, or you cut your finger and it was throbbing and it was just horrible. But then something unexpected happens in your day, or in that moment, and then suddenly you're dealing with something else. Yep. And the pain is gone.
Yep. Totally forgot about it. So it really is all about, and this fits with moment-to-moment thinking also, you are a changing being all of the time. And that's what we need to think about. I think people want to think about it as it's an emotional issue up to 24 hours, and then it shifts to a doubt issue. Well, that would be a random theory right there, and it wouldn't account for the individual mind, and it would basically be saying somehow math chooses these numbers, But if we think about it from the vantage point of, okay, if you're really still struggling with the emotional issue and it's manifesting physically, that's an emotional issue. If you've started to worry, if you started to have fear, confusion, doubt, questions, that's when it becomes a doubt issue. So I hope I'm coming across clearly on this, that it really depends on how you are thinking about the issue. What I will say is that emotional issues do tend to be pretty short in their nature. Speaking of moment to moment, we become different people emotionally very quickly. Throughout your day, you're hundreds of different people, different moments in any given day, thousands maybe. And so it's not likely that the emotional issue is going to last very long.
Now, could I ask you a question? Mm-hmm. What if this would go to the how step, I'm thinking, that distraction, not in the negative sense of like, you just quit distracting yourself. We're usually telling people not to do that in so many situations, but would distraction be something that maybe our listeners know that there's certain things that they do that gets their mind off of it?
Oh, absolutely.
Would you use distraction as a how?
Yes.
Or an action? I should say actions as the action.
No, I've worked with many people, particularly people who get to kind of plateaus and they get stuck. What they need is to stop thinking about the symptoms so much. And in fact, this question
to break the cycle.
Yeah, this question of, is it emotional? Is it doubt? They can get really stuck in that cycle. And sometimes you just have to trust this process will work its way out. I don't need to think about this so much. I'm going to go ahead and do this other thing. So that's a great question. I do want to make sure that we get to this last question, so we can talk more about what you asked there, because I think it's a great one. We got a question. It came from our Facebook page. One of our viewers, Mike Hogan, asked this question: can you discuss how Erik Erikson's autonomy versus shame and doubt plays into the doubt part of the name of your podcast and MBS, or mind-body syndrome, in general? So first, I just want to explain for those listening who don't know Erik Erikson. He was one of the seminal psychologists in the field, and he had 8 stages of life that were really about a central dilemma. The first one is trust versus mistrust. When you are a baby, you are establishing, can I trust the world or can I not? The second one is autonomy versus shame and doubt. What this means is the child, usually a 2-year-old actually, it's around that time, as Erikson put it, is trying to decide, do I have to be ashamed of who I am and what I want? And they're full of doubt. It's a very doubting time. Autonomy, though, is about feeling good. I am solid. I know what I'm doing. I can go forward in life. So I mean, I have thought about this before. It did not play, at least not consciously, it didn't play any role in the naming of the podcast. But I do think he's hitting on a very similar idea, just how powerful doubt actually is. Because what he's saying is, if a kid doubts themselves, they will not achieve autonomy, at least not as well. It might be a partial autonomy or a compromised autonomy, or maybe it's an autonomy in certain areas but not in others. Shame is a big thing in and of itself. So shame is different than doubt, but they're both things that hold you back from feeling powerful and good. And this is how those columns can kind of run together. The doubt column, if you can reduce doubt, it actually helps you feel more powerful and it helps you have more autonomy in your life. So while it wasn't part of the naming of the podcast, it completely fits with it. And one other point I wanted to make, and this was something Mike said in a follow-up as I discussed this with him a little bit. He said, it kind of makes sense that this really fits, especially because we don't really remember those times from when we're 2. Very few people have any memories of being 2. And one thing I said to him back is, yeah, this makes a lot of sense that the doubt is really embedded in us from very early on. We had doubts all the way back from when we were really little kids. But if you can't remember something, it's even more likely to become a physicalized experience. If you're looking at what types of emotional issues become a somatic response, a mind-body response, they're the ones that are less conscious, especially from the emotional side of things. So I just thought that was a fascinating question and very astute. So thank you for asking that, Mike. I hope I answered it well enough. You can follow up with me if not. In the meantime, I wanted to thank...
Keep the questions coming.
Yeah, keep the questions coming. I wanted to thank everybody for watching and listening. It's really been a joy getting to connect with our audience, so keep the comments coming. We appreciate you. Thank you for watching and listening. Please click subscribe, hit like, and ring the bell for notifications on YouTube. Sign up for our newsletter on crushingdoubt.org for information on new episodes or to sign up for my live seminars.
You can find us on all social media platforms at Crushing Doubt. For questions you'd like answered, please send us an email at info@crushingdoubt.org. To keep our podcast going, please consider a donation at Venmo at Crushing Doubt.
I am here to help you resolve your doubts on your journey and find powerful, peaceful, and happy living.